I knew there had to be a different way. I knew there had to be a different process. I knew I needed to learn the actual rules to the game, because you get kicked in the mouth a few times. You go ahead and you have a choice. You either lay there and cry about it, or you understand how to counter that kick. And that is the basis of what my firm does, is to ensure that somebody who's moving the needle and making things happen is at a place where they can play the sport fairly. They can go back and start wearing shoulder pads instead of thinking it's the 1930s NFL with the leather helmets. If you're going to go to battle, make sure you have the proper armor, depending on what you're going up against. And that is the real that I want to share with you, is that if you are not actively out there building a properly structured security, and you really want to scale and grow what you're currently doing, you're going to put yourself on the wrong edge of the sword.
Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist Podcast, the ultimate destination for accredited investors and entrepreneurs seeking alternative wealth building strategies. Discover how to fast-track your journey to wealth and time freedom by thinking outside the box. If you're ready to join the ranks of the Contrarian Capitalists and learn the most effective ways to reach your financial goals faster, you're in the right place. Let's get started with today's episode of the Contrarian Capitalist Podcast.
Thank you once again for joining another episode of the Contrarian Capitalist Podcast. I'm your host and your favorite silverback, Sylvania Harrod, and on today's episode, I'm going to tell you one of the top lies that you've been listening to when it comes to business. So to all the listeners that are out there, if it's your first time, you'll learn that my job as the leader of our Contrarian tribe is to make sure that I educate you on some of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happens along the sport of wealth building and business. And so through those different phases, I always like to keep it real, because I'm a truth seeker naturally, and I look to be able to find out different pieces of information along the way, and I just test it, and I see if there's any consistent patterns. That was the gift that God gave me, is the ability to recognize and see patterns and see what outcomes are going to be there. It's natural in my engineering mind. But there's this one thing that I've noticed that has been a secret for the last 100 years that just isn't readily available and talked about, and is the land of securities. So a security is anything that is defined under in the US here, the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission. So the SEC has two different type of well-defined securities, one being a fund and one being a syndication. The structure of the security is actually to protect the investors from the company they're investing into, as well as creating a layer of security between the business owner and the investors. Because let me take you down a linear path and I'll tell you more about the nonlinear path. So the linear path that most go through, and we're going to talk about real estate, for example, is they're going to go out and you're going to start raising capital. So as you go and raise capital outside of a security, you're just gonna be like, hey, I found this property, I found this asset and this thing to be able to be here. I'm going to go raise money because I got a $20 million product. I need $5 million in order to secure the note. In that basic equation, what's going to happen is you can go raise the money and grab the money to be able to be there, but you have no insulation between you and your investors. So that investor at any moment in time could pick up the phone and call you and say, hey, what are you doing? What's happening? Actually, I want control of the project, because you don't know what you're doing to be able to be there. And you run through this phase of, okay, somebody else is going to be in here. They may get a little piece of control at different elements, and they're going to make your life, in some ways, it can be a nightmare because you have no protection. Another form of this is also what you look at in traditional private equity transactions. So you build a business, you're looking to go raise capital, and private equity comes and says, hey, I like what you're doing, be able to be here. Here's this magical number I'm going to throw out there of like what I'm going to buy your company for. You're feeling all good. You're like, damn, they about to drop 30 mil in my pocket. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. You start going through this whole process until you actually get to the contracting and the paperwork. And what you realize is they're going to pay you 30 mil, but it's a 10-year deal. And so what they're going to do is they're going to give you $4 million in cash, and the other 26 million is going to be in stock or options or things to be able to go through there. And there's going to be certain tranches because you have to stay on board for 5 years in order to receive that level of payout. Well, what ends up happening is that because you don't actually have a security and they're inbound, they are in the driver's seat and you are not. So they could go through an experience where they're buying you, but their objective is we're actually going to go and buy 4 other companies. So you sit here, you get close to the window of when you think, damn, I've built this whole business on my back, blood, sweat, and tears, go through that process. And now I'm an employee again. And now I have somebody I got to answer to when I used to have autonomy to make decisions when I needed to. I got blinded by the lights of capital being able to come into me. So you got a better house, better expenses, things to be able to go through there. But now you're secretly miserable because you're going through and you're there, and then they buy other companies. And all of a sudden, that additional $26 million that you thought you were going to get because you got different shares just got diluted down to 13 because they bought 2 more companies and they brought them all together. Then one day they're like, all right, cool, we got to get a return because we're on a 5-year cycle. So we're going to push all these companies together, and you're either in or you're out. So your shares have been watered down and diluted. The amount of money you thought you were going to get in return for the hope that one day they go public, but they don't. Because they know they can't get the 400x return they need to be taking it to the public markets. So now you're back at zero. And your stock may not be worth anything if they ever happen to go in. It's just getting flipped from company to company, which is loading it up with debt. And there's no possibility to actually create that outcome. All because you didn't have a security. If you had a security, you would have the ability to inverse that whole relationship. Because in that structure of a security, you have what's called a general partner, which is the decision-making power. And you have limited partner. Limited partner is the investor. So the SEC denotes if you build a proper security that there's a line in the sand. They can't ask you for crap because they sign a subscription agreement. Based upon that subscription agreement will determine the terms that they are opting into. And if they choose to violate those terms, SEC, go do what you do. Go get your money, right? This is the same thing that these laws were created back in 1934. You got 33 and 34. Read them, because once you know what those are, now you can go do that. The lie that you normally see is that, oh man, these guys they're now valued at, because they raised $300 million, they're now valued at $1 billion to be able to go there. What they don't tell you is how much in shares the original owners had to give up in order to get that level of valuation. And really, who gets a lion's share of that valuation? You guys have heard me mention about the golden rule, right? He with all the gold makes all the fucking rules. And so if you don't understand the process of building a security, I'm sorry, player. You're going to learn the hard way, because you're going to sell your company. You're going to think you're big shit in it, when the reality is that the person who actually helps you go sell the company, you're probably going to make more than you going to make in the transaction. And the other people that were the investors along the way are going to make more than you did in the scenario, because you have an inverse relationship into how it actually works. So let's go nonlinear for a second. Nonlinear, guess what happens? If you have a security, you can insulate yourself. Say you have a fund, because a fund builds multiple assets. A syndication is one for one asset. So you may create a syndication directly for your company. It depends on what it is. Then you can go to these big banks and big people that have dollars that start with a T and be like, cool, I am raising $100 million. Here's the terms. Here's the opportunity. I've gone to the right accounting firm. I've gone to the right SEC attorneys. I've paid the necessary toll that I know somebody that can be able to create a proper financial narrative that those guys are looking for, because your environment creates your outcomes. So if I have all those things dialed in, then guess what I can do? I can go and I can raise, because I know what questions they're going to ask, because my job is to figure out where all the no's lie and then craft a narrative around that. So that the only thing that investor is left to say is yes, that's the basis of it. And so if you have that armed, now you become the private equity firm. Build your own. And your own private equity firm can invest into your own company, because that's the basis of running your own private bank. You can take that, if you understand non-linearly, what to be able to do. And now you become the person with all the gold to go ahead and make the rules. And so that example that I shared with you earlier is a personal story. I have watched numerous companies go through that cycle. It's also why traditional private equity has such a bad taste. They have a boogeyman. Boogeyman, the Grim Reaper comes knocking on your door. You can dance with them if you want to. But as I shared to all my fellow contrarians, is that I'm here to share with you the truth of what I realize. I've seen companies get offered X amount of money. They don't do it. Then what happens is the company becomes their largest customer. They get all kinds of people, they hire all kinds of things, and they stop paying their bills because they know they have more money than you, so they can outlast you when it comes time for you to do all the suits and things you need to do. Because now you're bleeding in capital. You have none. You have to fire your employees. You try to go to court and try to do all kinds of things, but it takes 3-4 years of your life away from you. Eventually you get tired and broken down and you're just like, screw it. And then they buy you out of bankruptcy court for pennies on the dollar just to shelf your technology. It's just the brutal, ugly sport of business. If you play a full contact sport, sometimes you're going to break bones, and that's okay. But if you can have the proper understanding of what you're getting yourself into, the easier it becomes. And so naturally, as I always do, to land the plane, this is the basis of why I went down this road to begin with, is because I knew there had to be a different way. I knew there had to be a different process. I knew I needed to learn the actual rules to the game, because you get kicked in the mouth a few times, you go ahead and you have a choice. You either lay there and cry about it, or you understand how to counter that kick. And that is the basis of what my firm does, is to ensure that somebody who's moving the needle and making things happen is at a place where they can play the sport fairly. They can go back and start wearing shoulder pads instead of thinking it's the 1930s NFL with the leather helmets. If you're going to go to battle, make sure you have the proper armor depending on what you're going up against. And that is the real that I want to share with you, is that if you are not actively out there building a properly structured security and you really want to scale and grow what you're currently doing, you're going to put yourself on the wrong edge of the sword. Doesn't mean if you haven't been cut yet, that's fine. I'm a probability guy, right? I look at data, diverse sets of data, to be able to create the narrative to say if this is true or this is false. If you don't believe me, Google private equity horror stories and see all the Reddit threads you're going to be able to find to be able to justify that what I'm telling you is the truth. That's okay. But once we recognize truth, then we can make a clear and intelligent choice of what we want to do going forward. And I'm here to serve, as always. So if you need to get a hold of me, you can reach me on most social media platforms at my first name, last name, Sylvania Harrod. Email me, DM me. If you find my number and text me and say, yeah, you listened to this episode and you're interested about talking further, I'm here to serve you. So go out there, live the lives of your desire, and stay grateful, my friends. Until the next episode. Cheers.